The grading system goes from A1 to making no sense at all pretty damn fast. It just doesn't work so well, and here's why. In theory, the grades go from A1, super easy, to A5, total death. The ratings are based entirely on the danger of the climb. It's nothing to do with how physically strenuous the pitch is or how difficult it might be to figure out the moves. It's all about the danger. And the system doesn't really work. Here's why. On an A1 pitch, every piece of gear is pretty much bomber. You will typically be climbing obvious crack systems on good rock, placing cams and nuts, maybe the occasional piton. Not only is this very safe, it's also much easier to figure out the moves, because you are following obvious crack systems. A2 pitches are generally kind of the same, but the gear is smaller. You might be placing micro nuts or beaks, or have a little bit of loose rock that you need to move around, but in general it's still quite safe. The grading system works fairly well up to this point. Then along comes A3, which spans a much wider range of difficulty, even though it's the same grade. On a typical A3 pitch, you'll get good gear, but you'll also have to use hooks, copperheads, and negotiate loose and expanding rock. Then along comes the grade of A4, which kinda could mean anything. Some A4 pitches are really not that bad, especially if it's well travelled and there's a lot of fixed gear in the pitch. Or it could be an endless nightmare of rotten rock and death blocks, where you suffer in a perpetual state of terror, sketching from one horrendous placement to another. Sometimes it will take over 30 minutes to construct a science project placement, which enables you to tremble 1 foot higher up the 3,000-foot wall. Fear builds exponentially as you become further and further removed from anything secure and completely uncertain that you'll ever reach a belay. Even though you began the pitch at sunrise, it is now sunset. You enter into a new and unfamiliar state of panic, dehydration and delirium. Exhausted and on the brink of insanity, you must mantle out of your aiders into a long free climbing section of unknown difficulty. This is protected below by a string of worthless junk and must be climbed whilst wearing a massive clustered aid rack. Balanced at the top of these desperate run-out free moves, you must stretch high to place a tiny copperhead and transition back to the final section of improbable aid moves to a belay which must be constructed from pitons and duct tape. And then there is A5, which is kind of the same as A4, definitely total death if you fall, and probably not the best place to start. There is also the Clean Aid grading system, which works in a similar way. Clean Aid means using gear that doesn't require a hammer to place or remove. This is much kinder on the rock. A0 means a bolt ladder. C1s are generally easier than A1s because you don't need to place pitons. The grades tend to overlap as shown. Clean aiding does less damage to the rock because you're not hammering pitons, but in general it's actually more dangerous to climb the same feature using clean aid gear because you'll be placing things like cam hooks that don't really work as protection instead of smashing in a bomber piton that would hold a fall. Probably. Grades of C4 and C5 don't really exist. And that's because in order to climb that kind of terrain, you'll have to place copperheads and pitons, so you'll need a hammer to do this. On popular routes, these pieces of gear are sometimes fixed in the rock, which means they've been left behind by previous climbers, which makes it super easy to climb. But if a fixed piece is missing, you'll need a hammer to replace it. Or maybe you could use only clean Ed gear on an A2 pitch and make it more dangerous. But that doesn't really make any sense, because you could just place some bomber pitons and make it safer. But then, Ed climbing doesn't make any sense anyway. To confuse things even further, a climb might start out as A4 and then get downgraded to C2. This typically happens with most Ed climbs, and that's because the repeated placing and removing of pitons actually widens the placement, and eventually it becomes a much more reliable cam or nut placement. Copper heads get removed and replaced and eventually become bigger and are left fixed. Loose features break off and bolts get added, and generally, the more ascents a climb has had, the more obvious it is how to climb it. As well as the Ed climbing grading system, there is also the Big Wall grading system. Every climb receives a grade which determines the length of time and commitment required to climb it. A grade 4 is typically a long multi-pitch free climb, which will be done within a day, and Big Wall grades start at grade 5 and go up to 7. Although this system also doesn't really work, and that's because there is only 3 grades to describe every Big Wall climb on the planet. But basically, a grade 5 means that you'll probably spend 1 night on the wall. Grade 6 covers the majority of big walls, where it could take between 2 days and 2 weeks. Grade 7 is reserved for extremely difficult, aid-intensive routes on huge walls in remote environments, often with hostile weather and no possibility of a rescue. It is recommended to start with a few grade 5s before you progress to a grade 6.